People are basically good. That's something that I forget sometimes, and probably all of us do. You see, it's a couple of years ago, I was outside of a restaurant over in the Hamilton Place area, and I was going in to buy gift certificates for our church staff for Christmas. It was Christmas time, and there were Christmas carols on the radio. 'Tis the season to be jolly. I pull into the parking lot for the restaurant, and there is a van sitting there, and it is in everybody's way. It is just parked. They're sitting. I don't know what they're waiting on. The car's coming the other direction, and they're sitting waiting. I couldn't get around them. And the back of my car is about 2-3 feet out in Gun Barrel Road. And I'm worried. If I'd known what a piece of junk my car was, I would have just parked it there. And I'm aggravated. And it didn't matter what season it was. At one point, it took so long that I couldn't resist anymore. And I just lay down on my horn. And in just a few seconds later, out of the van steps an elderly woman with a cane. And I felt so ashamed. First thing that goes through my mind is, I sure am glad I'm not in the church van. And I don't know how old she was, but I'm sure she remembered Reagan being a Democrat. And this wave of guilt and shame just poured over me until she turned around and looked me in the eye. And with a gesture told me what I always suspected, that I was number one. Yep. And it probably blew her away, my response, because my response was, I started laughing. Because she had given me the best Christmas present I had ever gotten. I got a story, and we were even. I did something horrible, she did something horrible. The reality is, neither one of us treated the other like Jesus would have treated him. There would have been more patience on my part. There would have been less retaliation on her part. You know, we started this series. We've talked about an unconventional way to fulfillment and an unordinary way to earn trust. And this week we're talking about an unorthodox way to treat people. And we've kind of based it loosely on Jesus' statement in John 14:6, where he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And no man comes to the Father except through me. And through that statement, we understand a couple of things. We understand to miss Jesus, if he's the way, the truth, and the life, is to miss great blessing on this earth. And we also understand, if no man comes to the Father except through him, to miss Jesus means that we could possibly miss out on eternity. And so the reality of what's going on there is that we call Jesus unconventional, and we call Jesus unordinary, and we call Jesus unorthodox. Yet, if we're to be what he calls us to be, that we're to be in the world and not of the world, the reality is that we should be too. That just like Jesus, we should be unconventional and unordinary and unorthodox in our community and in this culture. We should be people who are as well. When we think about an unorthodox way to treat people, the reality is this: we will never be able to treat people the way Jesus treated people until we learn to love people the way Jesus loved people. And so this morning, I want to talk just a few minutes about how Jesus loved people and the kind of people that Jesus loved. And I hope that we can apply this to ourselves and use it immediately. Like Helen Keller or Anne Frank once said, we never have to wait one single minute to start making the world better. And so that's what I hope that we'll do with this lesson today. First thing I want to tell you is, if we want to love like Jesus, we have to love those who disagree with us. This is significantly different from the world we live in, simply because in the world that we live in, people love people who are like them. You know, if you have the same interests, you have the same clubs, you go to the same church, you believe the same things. We like people who are like us. And we love people who love us. And we like people who maybe be on the same socioeconomic level. We choose and tend to gravitate toward people who are very much like us. Yet in Jesus' economy, he looks at this very differently. In Matthew chapter 5, verses 43 through 48, he says, "You have heard it said that you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and unrighteous. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax gatherers do the same? If you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? Therefore, you're to be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect." He's saying, we're going to live in a world where people disagree because we all see things from a different perspective, but the reality is this. If we only like people who agree with us, what makes us different? Remember, we're called to be in the world and not of the world. We're called to be different from the world. And he says, you know what? If you only like the people who like you and you only love the people who love you, what makes you different? In what way are you ever going to be unique enough to garner the attention of the culture so that they'll want to know why you're different? He says we have to love the people who disagree with us. You know, I was at summer celebration at Lipscomb a couple of weeks ago, or yesterday. I mean, that's the way my time goes. It was a couple of weeks ago. And I was sitting down with lunch, and I didn't see anybody there that I knew very well. And so I sat down with an acquaintance to have lunch. And one of his friends, who's a very young preacher, is preaching in one of the inner city churches in Nashville. He comes and sits down. We talk for a little while. And finally, I asked him this question. I said, what's your greatest challenge in the church that you're in? And what I expected him to say was very different from what he said. I expected him to say something like, well, you know, we're struggling making budget. I know he's in a poor part of Nashville. We're struggling making budget. He didn't say that. Or he didn't say, you know, I'm having a hard time reaching this community. This community is just so racked with sin, and it's so racked with evil, and there are gangs. And I thought maybe that would be the thing he said, but that's not what he said either. What he said was this. He said, the biggest problem in our church is that our people just cannot get over that last election. Of course, now I'm thinking to myself, if that's your biggest problem, you're golden, dude. But it's true. I mean, we live in a politically divisive nation. And never have we been divided more than we are now. But the problem is not just we have different ideals and ideologies. The problem is that we can't disagree without going to war with one another. We can't sit down and have a conversation and maybe even get up to agree to disagree. Our calling is to love people where they are. And we have to get to the point where we can be like Jesus and say, you know what, if you only love the people who agree with you, what makes you different? And get to the point where when we disagree with people, instead of saying, how in the world can you think that? Maybe the best thing we can do is back away from it and say, I wonder why they think that. I don't really understand. You know, I believe that with all of us, there is someone that God's put in our life that sharply disagrees with us. And what God wants from us more than anything else is for us to love them anyway. Because Jesus taught and exemplified loving people who disagreed. Second thing is that we are to love people who are disadvantaged. Jesus did. Jesus loved people who were broken and hurting and didn't, or the have-nots, and he loved the haves and all the people that had these struggles in life, but especially those who had these physical struggles, these ailments in their lives. And he didn't do it in order to gain attention. He didn't do it in order to manipulate people. He didn't do it so everyone would look at Jesus and say, look how great he is because of the way he treats those people. He didn't do it in order to feed some guilt within himself that says, I am so healthy and it's so wrong that they're not healthy. He only did it because he cared about them. And he was ridiculed for it. You know, if you only hang out with those people who are broken and lame and blind and destitute, guess what? Birds of a feather flock together. That's what our culture says. And there were people that said, well, you know what? He hangs out with people like sinners and tax gatherers. He must be one of them. But the reality is just so different. The reality of someone whose normal day was filled with people who were overlooked and ostracized. In God's economy, disadvantaged people are loved and disadvantaged people are valued. Christianity is based on the reality that everyone has value and everyone can be used by God. Whoever you are, you need to know that you matter. No matter what's going on in your life, you need to know that you matter. When it comes to the disadvantaged, Jesus made this statement in Luke chapter 14. He says, and he also went on to say to the one who invited him, he says, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or your rich neighbors. Otherwise, they will repay you. They may invite you in return, and that will be your repayment. But when you give a reception, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed, since they do not have the means to repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. He's saying, pay attention to the people that no one pays attention to. The disadvantaged. The people who live their lives every day as a reminder that we live in a broken world and that sin has wrecked it. Physically, emotionally, spiritually. I don't know if you follow sports. I really like sports. Now, I'm not a baseball fan. I'll admit that. I watch baseball so that I can go to sleep, and it's just so slow. But there's one baseball player that I'm really starting to kind of follow. This week, Tim Tebow hit a walk-off home run to help his team. He's on a AAA ball club to help his team win. Now, I've never seen anyone as persecuted for their beliefs as I've seen Tim Tebow persecuted. Is he a great ball player? I don't know. He's a great athlete. But they want to pick on this guy. And they love it when he fails. And, you know, they report all kinds of things, but there's one thing that I never heard one single report about. You see, he's done well in his life, and he started a thing called the Tim Tebow Foundation. He requires no press releases. He's not into being recognized for what he did. But this past February, he sponsored something called Night to Shine. Night to Shine is actually a prom for disabled, mentally, physically disabled teenagers. And what he wanted to do is he wanted to have a special night for these people who probably wouldn't get to go to a prom or to do anything like that. He wanted to have a special night for them to celebrate and to shine. And so he starts trying to get volunteers. He gets people who are hairdressers to do the hair for the young girls, and seamstresses to help with dresses, and people to volunteer tuxedos, and people to drive cars, limo drivers. He gets caterers and volunteers to chaperone. Churches volunteer to have something like that in their buildings. And so when he was finished getting volunteers, he ended up with over 150,000 volunteers. There were parties in all 50 states, in 11 countries. 28 different denominations sponsored this, and the party began at 6 o'clock in Philippines on February 10th. And it spread across the world until the last one ended at 9 o'clock in Hawaii. Why? A guy who has everything, who has plenty of means, why would he take millions of his own dollars and put it to something like this? And it's because he remembers what we often forget, that the gates of heaven are handicapped accessible. But only on the outside. Because in the kingdom of God, we're all the same. And we all matter. And God can use us all. Mark Twain once said, kindness is a language that the deaf can hear and the blind can read. And I can't think of a truer statement. And I hope that you'll remember when God is forced to choose, when you look throughout Scripture, when it comes to right down to it, if God is forced to choose, He always lands on the side of the broken, the hurting, and the disadvantaged. He always is on the side of those people who are broken mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually. I hope we never force Him to choose. We're to love those people who are disadvantaged. We're also to love people who are different from us. We're to love people who disagree with us. We're to love those people who are disadvantaged because culture doesn't. And we're to love those who are different from us. Jesus was no respecter of persons. And the reality is He loved people who were very, very sick. In the days of Jesus, leprosy was much like the AIDS of our day. Leprosy was actually worse because if you had leprosy, you became sequestered. You were thrown out of society, and you were not allowed to be near anyone who was well. No one was allowed to touch you because that would spread the disease. And they were terrified of what was going to happen because it was such a horrible, horrible illness. And then we see how Jesus dealt with it. In Mark chapter 1, a leper came to Jesus, beseeching Him and falling on His knees before Him, saying, if you're willing, you can make me clean. And moved with compassion, Jesus stretched out His hand and touched him, and He said, I am willing. Be cleansed. And do you see what Jesus does here? When it comes to this person who is sick, not only is He willing to help him and able to help him, but He gives him something that he hadn't had in a long time. He touched him. Do you know how important touch is? They say in a marriage that if you don't average hugging your wife or your husband once a day, your marriage will soon be in trouble. Don't look at each other. Do you know how important it is to have this sense of touch? And who is in your life that needs that hug if it's appropriate, or that pat on the back, the high five, the fist bump, the handshake, whatever it is that needs that touch from you? They may be different from you, but they still need to be noticed. And the lesson in here is, we will never reach the unreachable until we're willing to touch the untouchable. Second thing, He loved the sick. He loved the rich. And I'm going to tell you, if you want to be different from me, be rich. Because I'm not. And I'm not even good at not being rich. For instance, I'm one of these guys that every now and again I get to travel, and I go to these hotels and I stay in. So I've stayed in accidentally some really, really nice hotels. And when I was traveling with AT&T, it was the same way. And I'm one of these guys, I go in and I look and it's like, dude, that shampoo's expensive. So I take it. And the soap, and the conditioner, and the hand lotion. I have 4 sewing kits. I don't even sew. That's just the way I am. I'm not sure I would ever be good at being rich because rich people are just so different from me. Jesus had friends who were rich. He had friends like Lazarus, Joseph of Arimathea, Nicodemus, Zacchaeus. And these were all people that when they were placed in the way of Jesus, He saw past their wealth so He could see their true condition. So I'm convinced that, many times we think just because people have everything they need physically, that they have everything they need spiritually, and they do not. When we first started talking about Vision 2020 at our church, and we were talking about we want to reach people who are unchurched and dechurched, the first thing everybody's mind goes to is those people who may be impoverished in some way. But the reality is that people who are wealthy are just as unchurched and dechurched as the others. But are we willing to invite them? Are we willing to see past their situation so that we can see their true need? Jesus did. So he loved people who were sick. He loved people who were rich. He loved people who were poor. In Luke chapter 21, we read this. It says, and he looked up and saw the rich putting their gifts into the treasury. He's at the temple. And he saw a poor widow putting in 2 copper coins. And he said, truly I say to you, this poor widow put in more than all of them. For they all out of their surplus put in the offering, but she out of the poverty put in all that she had to live on. And I just see this scene. And the way they did it at the temple, by the way, is they would go in and they would worship. And on their way out, there were these places that they collected your alms and gifts. And I can see the rich people going by and making a big show of all the money that they were putting in there, or maybe they weren't. But then I see this poor little woman walk up, and she drops in these 2 copper coins, praying to God that no one hears them hit the bottom of the receptacle. Hoping that no one would notice how little she has, even though just to look at her you probably knew. And then this rabbi, Jesus, is standing there and says, but this woman, and she's going, oh great, he saw me. But this woman has given more than all of you. Well, why would he say something like that? Because he knew something about her situation they didn't know. She had given everything she had. She wouldn't eat that week because she didn't have money. There would be things she needed that week she wouldn't get because she didn't have money. She had given everything she had. And in our world, the reality is that this dividing line between the rich and poor seems to get further apart, yet it becomes incredibly divisive, and Satan enjoys it. And it works outside the church, it works within the church. Horrible things are said by people who have not about those who have, and horrible things are said about the people who have by the things who have not. And it's like, well, they're greedy and they're stingy and that's why they have all this. And the other, well, they don't want to work and they don't care about having a good ethic in their life, and that's why they're in the situation they're in. When the reality is, rich or poor usually depends more on where you're born and who you're born to than anything else. So why in the world would we have this divisive argument? Because what Jesus is saying is he's saying, I love sick people, I love rich people, I love poor people, because no matter who they are, if you're wealthy people, guess what? You know other people. Use whatever you have in order to share the story of Jesus. If you're impoverished people, use whatever you have to share the story of Jesus with the people around you. Wherever you're planted, bloom where you're planted, because that's my gift to you. He loved people who were different from him. And we should too. The kingdom needs both to bloom where they're planted. Last thing I want to talk about is that he loved people who are sick, he loved people who are rich, poor. He really loved people who were desperate. We see people in our culture who are desperate and in our society that are desperate, and we want to stay away from them because desperation scares us. But the reality is that the richest soil is at the bottom. And when we finally get to the bottom and hit the bottom, that's when the richest soil takes place in our life. And Jesus knew that. And the story I want to share here is what happened with one man who was at the bottom. There was a place during the time of Jesus called the Decapolis. Decapolis, Deca means 10, Opolis means city. It was really just this region that had 10 cities in it. And this region of 10 cities was well known for being a sinful, horrible place. It was not filled with Jews. They were people who had herded pigs. It was one of those places that when Jesus was making up this story of the prodigal son, people probably imagined that this son, when he went to the riotous wild living, went to a place like Decapolis. Well, Jesus is teaching and he's worn out and it's time to leave. And so he tells his disciples, let's get in the boat and let's go to the other side. And they all knew what was on the other side. It was Decapolis. And so they get in the boat and they go to the other side. And they were used to, when they would land on the shore, thousands of people would show up because they wanted to hear the story of Jesus. They wanted to hear him teach. They wanted to hear this new yoke where it said, you have heard this, but now I tell you this. But when they got to the Decapolis, they weren't met by thousands of people. They were met by one person. And they heard him long before they saw him. He was a man who'd been possessed by many demons, called themselves Legion. He was living in a cemetery because no one wanted him in their presence. They had chained him, and he had broken the chains. They tried to clothe him. They couldn't keep him in clothes. They were ashamed of him. He was the scourge of the town. Yet when they land on the shore, he's the only one that came to see Jesus. And here's how that story went. And he was asking him, "What's your name?" talking to this man. But the demons would then answer and said, "Well, my name's Legion. We're many." And he began to implore him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now there was a large herd of swine feeding nearby on the mountain, and the demons implored him, saying, "Send us into the swine so that we may enter them." And Jesus gave them permission. And coming out, the unclean spirits entered the swine, and the herd rushed down the steep bank and into the sea, and about 2,000 of them, and they were drowned in the sea. I've always believed that this is living proof that people will live with things that a hog just can't stand. Right? And we'll live with filth that a pig will not even live with. But he comes to this person, he sees this problem, he deals with the problem, and we go on with the story and we find out that this man now is clothed and he's well and he's sitting down and people are marveling. But do you see their response? Their response was this: "Jesus, please go away." They didn't want to hear the story. They didn't want to know what was going on. All they know is that he had killed a bunch of pigs, or at least that's what they thought, and that was their livelihood, and they wanted him out of there. And so as he's about to get in the boat, there's one more conversation. He was getting into the boat, and the man who had been demon-possessed was imploring him that he may accompany him. And he did not let him. But he said to him, "Go home to your people and report to them the great things the Lord's done for you, and how he has had mercy on you." And he went away and began to proclaim in Decapolis what great things that Jesus had done for him, and everyone was amazed. I know his disciples were wondering what's happening here. You know, it's like, Jesus, you're the one that goes to people and says, "Okay, yeah, come follow me," but this guy wants to follow you and you don't want him to. I suspect Jesus didn't want to make a sideshow out of him, but it's obvious later on that he had other things in mind for this man. You see, the disciples were about to get in the boat and they were about to go back to the other side, and there would be another thousands of people who would treat them like a bunch of rock stars, and they're sitting there wondering, was this worth it? Why would Jesus want to go all the way over there for just one person? But Jesus had other plans. You see, the rest of the story goes something like this. In about 60 to 90 days, Jesus goes back to Decapolis. We find this in Mark chapter 7 and 8. And when he goes back 60 days later, he teaches there are 4,000 people who skipped meals and walked miles just to hear him teach. And he feeds those 4,000 people because of the testimony of an outcast, the testimony of a desperate man. But that doesn't even end the story. Because thousands weren't enough. You see, after Jesus died and he had been ascended into heaven, the Roman Empire did everything they could to destroy the church and to destroy Christianity. So much so that there was a great persecution. And John writes about a vision that he saw from Jesus, and Jesus writes encouraging words to 7 churches in Asia who are being persecuted by the Roman Empire. And to these 7 churches, he writes these notes, and they're scattered all over the place. And in each one of these letters, he says 5 things. He follows the same pattern in all 5 letters, or all 7 letters with the exception of 1. He identifies himself, tells who he is. He tells the church what he finds wonderful about them. He compliments them. Then he shares his greatest concern. He has a complaint with these churches. He tells them how to fix the problem. And then lastly, he says, if you do fix the problem, here's a promise from me that is a great blessing for you. All 7 churches. Well, 6 churches and then another one. He writes to a church called Philadelphia. And Philadelphia was the only one of these 7 churches that was located in the Decapolis. It was one of the 10 cities. And this is long after he had talked to this man in the tombs. And here's what he writes to this church. I know your deeds. Behold, I have put before you an open door which no one can shut, because you have a little power, and have kept my word, and have not denied my name. Oh, this is a great church. But you know what clues us in that it's even greater? It is the only one of the 7 churches that Jesus has no complaint about. He has nothing negative to say to these people, and it is such a wonderful church that he promises them that they would not be touched by any of the persecution, and they were not. Well, why would Jesus be so fond of this church? How could a church become so great? It happened because Jesus refused to ignore one desperate man who told somebody, and thousands and thousands and thousands of people came to Jesus because of a conversation in a graveyard. You know, you want to be on? I'll tell you how to be on. Hub McCann, the character that Robert Duvall plays, gives you the key to it. You know, people really are basically good. You want to know how to treat people? Treat them that way. That honor, courage, and virtue mean everything. Power and money and power mean nothing. Good always ultimately wins out over evil. And love, true love, never dies. And those things are worth believing in because Jesus believed them and lived them. He knew how to treat people. Jesus was always reaching out. He was always reaching out to people. The ambitious lawyer, the adulterous woman, the doubting disciple, the money-hungry tax collector, the wealthy ruler, the poor single mom, a paralyzed man, an unclean woman in a crowd, a woman fetching water by a well, and a criminal on a cross. He was reaching out constantly, no matter what their situation, and he's still doing it today. He still reaches out. His story still touches. And it teaches us how to treat people. If you're someone that Jesus is reaching out to you, I've got good news for you. It doesn't matter what you've done, it doesn't matter where you've been, it doesn't matter what your story is, because your story is not over. And if you think that you can't come to Jesus because of where you are, remember what I'm about to tell you. The ground has always been level at the foot of the cross. We're all equal. And we all matter to Jesus. And so if you're someone that you think you can't come to Jesus, I'm here to tell you that you can. And if you're someone who thinks that you can't reclaim this life, I'm here to tell you that it's possible. And it's possible because of who Jesus is and what he can mean to our lives.